And the last take-home message is if we work steadily on preparing, planning, adapting, then we do have time on our side to prepare for these impacts, because they are sort of slow-moving impacts that are going to be happening over the series of years and decades. And so we have time, we have good options available to us now if we start being proactive. Here's a pretty quick schematic of the Earth and the atmosphere. The temperature around the Earth is a delicate balance of incoming energy from the sun and then energy that gets radiated back out from the Earth into space. Carbon dioxide and methane are gases that are released from tailpipes of cars, from power plants, and from other natural and man-made sources. And once they get up into the atmosphere, they form a heat-trapping blanket. So radiation is able to come in from the sun, but it's not able to get back out. The blanket provides a little bit of extra insulation, keeps that energy from radiating back out into space, and as a result, there's an energy imbalance that's warming the atmosphere. So what does that warming look like? By the end of the century, the University of Maryland, and most of our projections here are going to come from the University of Maryland, projected that we'll see 4 to 8 degrees warmer by the end of the century, depending on a lot of things, but primarily depending on which pathway as a globe we take as far as reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So the blue column here, we'll take a look at the chart here on the left. The blue column is the number of 90-degree days typically experienced in the late 20th century, so the 1980s, 1990s time period. We were getting about 30 90-degree days per year. I went back and checked. We're at 33, I think, for Kent County so far this year, with about 6 weeks or so left in summer. So we're a little ahead of pace this year. The orange bar in that graph shows that we should expect maybe about 60 90-degree days. And if you take a look at the red graph, that's the worst case scenario, maybe as high as 90. So 60 to 90-degree days by the end of the summer. So obviously with heat, we've got concerns for folks who work outside. So a lot of the county employees who are working on the roads, working on buildings, they would be exposed here and potentially vulnerable to the consequences of having long days out in the heat. So some of the recommendations we were looking at are how can we change work schedules so the guys and girls are not out in the hottest parts of the day. We have populations of folks in the county who don't have air conditioners, and so their homes can't cool down as much at night. If the temperatures are in the 90s during the day, they may not break below the 80s at night, so the homes don't get to cool off for days or weeks at a time. So we've got concerns about folks who don't have air conditioners and maybe having some heat stress because they can't cool off at night and sort of get some recovery or respite from the heat. We've got concerns about the roads in the county, the actual physical roads, the tar and chip construction of the roads. We see we've got long periods of high heat and heavy machinery or heavy trucks going over the roads. We see the roads get deformed and having to be repaired more frequently. And then we've got concerns about the cooling system, the HVAC systems in a lot of the county buildings that were installed maybe back in the 80s and 90s, even before computers were a big thing in a lot of these buildings. And so the HVAC systems are struggling to keep up with just the heat generated by computers, let alone the heat that we may have from hotter summers down the road. So thinking about the systems that are keeping our county buildings cool. Precipitation is the next hazard that we looked at, and again, data here from the University of Maryland, expecting a 10 to 20% increase in the amount of precipitation per year. And it doesn't mean that every single rain event is going to be 10 to 20% higher. What it more likely means is that we're going to get more heavier rainstorms. The map on the left here, the blue areas are parts of the country that have already seen an increase in precipitation annually. So we're sort of in one of the middle shades of blue there, so we've probably experienced about a 5 to 10% increase in the amount of precipitation that we get on an annual basis. On the right, the four depictions there are the 4 seasons, and so we see that our winters and springs are going to be a bit wetter, while our summer is going to be drier. Sea level is the third aspect that we looked at here. The graph that you have here is from the tide gauge in Baltimore Harbor. And we're lucky to have Baltimore Harbor tide gauge so close because it's one of the oldest records in the world for sea level. The up and down, the blue lines are, it's probably a monthly average. So you see there's a lot of variability in sea level. It goes up some years, some decades are higher than others, but the trend is very clearly upwards. And we've seen slightly more than 1 foot of sea level rise in the last 100 years. That chart starts just after 1900, so that record is about 110 years long that you see right there. About half of that rise is due to sinking, the land sinking, subsidence, and about half of that is due to ocean levels rising. So by 2050, in 35 years from now, we're expecting 1.4 to 2.1 feet, so 1.5 to 2 feet of sea level rise. And the thing to remember about sea level rise is that it enables a weaker storm to have the same effect as a storm would have had a couple decades ago. So Isabel in 2003 was a tropical storm. We had, I was just looking at a video this morning of the storm in 1933. That was a Category 1 hurricane, and they both achieved about the same amount of flooding. They had similar storm tracks that make them comparable, and Isabel was a weaker storm, but it was able to achieve the same level of flooding because of that 1 foot of sea level rise that had happened in the ensuing 80 or so years. So the major point of doing this report was to come up with a list of recommendations that the county can consider for the various planning opportunities that we have coming up in the future. Those recommendations were broken down into the 8 categories that you see on the left-hand side. There were 21 broad recommendations. There were 48 actions, individual actions recommended by stakeholders, and then there are an additional 17 actions that the committee putting together a report is going to be recommending here.